Ballon d'Or was supposed to be simple. The best player, the biggest moments, the greatest season, one name, one trophy. But this year, none of it is simple. The latest World Cup didn't just add another chapter to the football calendar. It completely changed the conversation. Suddenly, the Ballon d'Or race isn't about one obvious favorite. It's about competing definitions of greatness. On one side, you have Harry Kane, the machine, the striker who spent an entire season turning goals into statistics that almost don't look real. Then there's Kylian Mbappe, the superstar built for the biggest stage. When the pressure rises somehow, so does he. And then there's Lionel Messi, the name that can change an entire debate before the debate even begins. Three players, three completely different cases. And depending on what you believe the Ballon d'Or should reward, any one of them can make a legitimate argument. But here's the problem. The public has already decided this is a three-man race. And that might be the first mistake. Because before we even get to the surprise names waiting later in this story, we need to establish exactly what these three players have done. No reputation, no fan bias, no nostalgia, just the evidence. Welcome to the trial. And our first charge is simple: production. Because before we talk about trophies, before we talk about legacy, before we talk about unforgettable moments, we have to ask the most basic question of all: who actually produced the most? And if we're judging the entire season, Harry Kane's case starts looking terrifying. Across the 64-game season, Kane produced an extraordinary 73 goals and 8 assists for club and country. That's 81 direct goal contributions. Think about how ridiculous that number is. Football has become more tactical. Defenses are more organized. The schedule is more demanding. And yet Kane just kept scoring again and again and again. There was no need for a dramatic narrative, no need for a spectacular storyline. Kane's argument was built almost entirely on repetition. He showed up and produced. Over an entire season, at club level, he reached 36 league goals, winning the European Golden Shoe. That's not a player having one incredible month. That's a player turning production into routine. And this is where Kane's Ballon d'Or argument becomes so difficult to dismiss. Because international tournaments are short. A player can explode for 4 weeks, but a full European season is brutal. 10 months, dozens of matches, different opponents, injuries, travel, pressure, fatigue, and Kane kept delivering through all of it. If the Ballon d'Or rewards the player who maintained the highest level for the longest period, then Kane has an enormous piece of evidence sitting right in front of the jury. But then the prosecution turns toward Madrid, and suddenly the numbers tell a completely different story. Because Kylian Mbappe doesn't need 73 goals to make this interesting. He has something Kane doesn't. A tournament where the entire football world was watching him. At the World Cup, Mbappe produced 10 goals and 4 assists, 14 goal contributions, one tournament, under the greatest pressure imaginable. And that distinction matters, because there are goals, and then there are goals when the entire planet is watching. Mbappe has always understood that difference. He doesn't simply score. He seems to become more dangerous when the stage gets bigger. The World Cup is the perfect example. While Kane's case is built around the marathons, Mbappe's is built around maximum intensity. Kane says, "Look at everything I did for an entire season." Mbappe says, "Look at what I did when the world was watching." And suddenly, we have our first real conflict. What should matter more, consistency or peak performance? Because the Ballon d'Or isn't awarded for simply being the player who scored the most goals. If it were, the debate would already be over. But football doesn't work like that. A striker can score 70 goals and still lose the award to someone who produced fewer goals but owned the biggest moments. And that brings us to the third witness, Lionel Messi. Messi's case doesn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. That's the problem. And that's also his greatest weapon. Because when Messi's at his best, statistics often feel like they're describing only half of what happened. A curling free kick into the top corner, a defender frozen by one movement, a pass nobody else saw, a moment where the entire stadium seems to understand what is coming and the defender still can't stop it. That's Messi's territory. Moments, memory, emotion, narrative. His research case is built around an international campaign of 8 goals and 4 assists, while carrying the weight of Argentina on the biggest stage. And this is where the Ballon d'Or becomes incredibly difficult to judge, because Messi doesn't just compete against Kane and Mbappe's numbers. He competes against the emotional weight of his own career. Every time Messi steps onto a major international stage, the story becomes bigger than the match itself. People aren't simply watching another footballer. They're watching one of the greatest players in history add another chapter to his legacy. And that creates a fascinating problem for the jury. Are we judging the season, or are we judging what that season meant? Because those aren't always the same thing. Kane's case is statistical. Mbappe's case is explosive. Messi's case is emotional. And all three can be defended. But now let's put them side by side. Kane, 73 goals, 8 assists, 81 goal contributions. Mbappe, 45 goals, 11 assists, 56 goal contributions. And Messi, 23 goals, 16 assists. On pure volume, Kane is ahead comfortably. But football isn't played inside a spreadsheet. And this is where the Ballon d'Or debate gets dangerous. Because if Kane wins, you're essentially saying saying that the award should reward the complete body of work, the player who performs at an elite level week after week after week. If Mbappé wins, you're saying that the highest pressure deserves the highest value, that a player who dominates the world's biggest tournament should be rewarded for doing what very few players can do. And if Messi wins, you're saying that football's greatest individual award cannot completely ignore the weight of historic moments. 3 players, 3 philosophies, and we're not even finished with the first round. Because production only tells us what they did. It doesn't tell us what they actually won. And that changes everything. Because when the Ballon d'Or ballot opens, voters aren't just looking at the goals column. They're looking at medals. They're looking at defining matches. They're looking at who stood above the rest when something was actually on the line. And that's where this trial gets much more complicated. Because Harry Kane's incredible numbers mean very little if the trophy cabinet doesn't support them. Mbappé's tournament heroics means something very different if his club season doesn't match them. And Messi's international legacy creates an entirely different question: how much should one extraordinary tournament influence an entire year's award? That is the question the jury now has to answer, because the first round has established one thing: there is no obvious winner. There is only evidence. Harry Kane may have been the most, and the evidence says something fascinating. Consistent producer Kylian Mbappé may have been the most dangerous player under pressure, and Lionel Messi may have created the strongest emotional case. But the Ballon d'Or isn't won by having the best opening argument. It's won by surviving the entire trial. And in the next round, we stop counting goals. We start counting what those goals actually meant. The first round gave us the numbers, and if this were a spreadsheet competition, Harry Kane would already be celebrating. But the Ballon d'Or has never been a spreadsheet competition, because football has another currency: trophies. Goals tell you how much a player produced. Trophies tell you what that production actually helped accomplish. And suddenly, the case becomes much harder to call. For years, Harry Kane's biggest weakness in Ballon d'Or debates was painfully obvious. The goals were there, the performances were there, the individual awards were there, but the medals weren't. That argument followed him everywhere. The greatest striker of his generation, without the major trophies to prove it. But this season, that narrative changed. Kane finally had silverware behind the numbers. He helped Bayern Munich claim domestic dominance, giving his individual production something it had been missing for years: a trophy cabinet to match it. And that matters, because there is a huge difference between scoring 70 goals for a team that wins nothing and scoring at that level while helping your club control its domestic competition. Kane supporters can now make a much stronger argument. He wasn't simply putting up ridiculous numbers. He was producing while competing for actual titles. But then Mbappé's side of the courtroom opens, and his evidence comes from a completely different direction, because Mbappé wasn't just fighting for domestic recognition. He was operating on multiple stages: La Liga, Europe, international football, and every stage brought a different kind of pressure. His supporters can point to domestic success, but the bigger argument is what happened when the competition became continental and global, because Mbappé's value has always been tied to one terrifying question: who do you want when everything is on the line? That is where his case becomes dangerous. Ballon d'Or winner isn't remembered because he scored against a random opponent on a Tuesday night. He's remembered because when the season reached its most important moments, he was there. And Mbappé has built his reputation around exactly that. But here's where we need to be careful, because big game player can become one of football's most abused phrases. A spectacular goal in a huge match can stay in our memories for years. Meanwhile, 30 consistent performances quietly disappear from our minds. That's the psychological trap of the Ballon d'Or. We remember moments. We don't remember every minute, and that's why Kane's argument still refuses to disappear. Because while Mbappé's supporters can point towards spectacular peak, Kane's supporters can point toward the entire mountain. 10 months of production, week after week, different competitions, different opponents, different circumstances. No 4-week tournament can erase that automatically. But then Lionel Messi enters the argument again, and suddenly the entire definition of trophy becomes complicated, because Messi's case isn't simply about collecting another medal. It's about what happens when a player becomes the central figure of an international story. His supporters argue that his international performances carried enormous weight. He wasn't simply another player inside the system. He was the player expected to create, to control, to score, to deliver. And when that responsibility is placed on one player, every successful moment becomes heavier. That's why Messi's case is so difficult to dismiss. There are players who contribute to winning, and then there are players who become inseparable from the story of winning. Messi has spent much of his career living in that second category, but now we reach the question that could decide the entire award. How much should the World Cup matter? Because this is where the 3 candidates begin pulling the Ballon d'Or in completely different directions. Imagine 2 players. One dominates football for 10 months. The other reaches a tournament and becomes almost unstoppable for several weeks. Who had the better year? There is no mathematical answer, and that's precisely why Ballon d'Or debates become so emotional. A World Cup isn't just another competition, it is the competition. The world's best players can spend an entire season building their reputation and then have everything changed by what happens during 1 month. That's exactly what happened to this race. Mbappe's World Cup production transformed his case. Messi's international campaign transformed his case. And suddenly Kane's incredible club consistency had to compete with something much harder to measure: international gravity. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A World Cup can create unforgettable moments while a full club season tests something completely different: endurance, consistency, adaptability, the ability to perform when you're exhausted, the ability to recover after a terrible game, the ability to produce against teams that have spent months studying you. That is why Kane's case is still alive, and it is also why Mbappe's case remains so powerful. They're being judged on two completely different tests. Kane passed the marathon, Mbappé dominated the sprint, and Messi is being judged on something even more complicated: legacy. Because when Messi performs on the international stage, the reaction isn't simply Messi played well, it's Messi has added another chapter to his story that carries enormous weight with voters. But should it? That's the question. Because if narrative becomes too powerful, statistics become irrelevant. And if statistics become everything, football loses the human element that makes these awards matter in the first place. The Ballon d'Or sits somewhere between the two, and that creates a problem. Because every candidate can exploit a different weakness in the voting system. Kane has the numbers, Mbappé has the spectacle, Messi has the story. But there's another layer we haven't discussed yet: the biggest matches. Because not all goals are created equal. Scoring against a team fighting relegation is valuable. Scoring against one of Europe's strongest sides in a knockout match feels different. A penalty in the 20th minute is important. A decisive goal when your entire season is hanging by a thread becomes legendary. And this is where Mbappe's supporters become very loud, because his reputation wasn't built on ordinary nights. It was built on occasions when the entire football world stopped to watch. His ability to produce under extreme pressure is one of the strongest arguments for his candidacy. But Kane can answer, because his biggest supporters will tell you something simple: you don't need fireworks every week when you're already destroying the opposition every week. And that is a legitimate argument. Sometimes the greatest sign of consistency is how ordinary, extraordinary performances begin to look. Kane scoring again, Kane scoring again, Kane scoring again. Eventually, the impossible becomes routine. And that can actually hurt a player in awards voting, because humans adapt. We stop being amazed. The first time a player scores 30 goals, it's historic. The next time, people expect it. The next time, it's just Tuesday. That's one of the strangest problems Kane faces. His consistency may actually make his greatness feel less dramatic. Mbappé has the opposite advantage. His biggest performances arrive wrapped in spectacle. Messi has another advantage entirely. His moments become mythology. And now, the jury is stuck, because we've reached the point where the numbers don't settle the argument. The trophies don't settle it. The World Cup doesn't settle it. And even the biggest moments don't settle it. There is still something missing: the competition itself. Because while everyone has been staring at Kane, Mbappé, and Messi, the Ballon d'Or race has been changing underneath them. The three-man debate was convenient. It was easy to understand. 3 superstars, 3 narratives, 1 trophy. But football rarely gives us anything that simple, because somewhere outside this courtroom, 2 players have been building cases of their own, and they aren't asking permission to enter the conversation. They are about to kick the door down. The jury thought this was Kane versus Mbappé versus Messi. They were wrong, because the next witness could completely destroy the entire case we've built so far. And once he enters this courtroom, we have to ask an even more uncomfortable question: what if the best player of the year isn't one of the 3 names everyone has been arguing about? The courtroom is quiet. Kane has presented his numbers. Mbappé has presented his biggest stage performances. Messi has presented a legacy that almost feels impossible to measure. And the jury is ready to choose. But then the courtroom doors open, and suddenly the entire case changes. Because there was one problem with the debate we just spent all this time having. We assumed there were only 3 candidates. We assumed the Ballon d'Or was a battle between the old giants of the conversation: Kane, Mbappé, Messi. But while everyone was arguing about those 3, someone else was winning. Enter Ousmane Dembele. And if you're thinking, wait, Dembele? That's exactly the point. Because Dembele's case isn't built around nostalgia. It isn't built around reputation. And it isn't built around one spectacular international tournament. It's built around something the Ballon d'Or has always claimed to value: winning. Dembele became the centerpiece of a Paris Saint-Germain side that achieved continental supremacy. He finished the campaign with 35 goals and 15 assists, 50 direct goal contributions. But even those numbers don't explain why his case suddenly becomes so dangerous. Because Dembele wasn't simply putting up statistics. He was the attacking centerpiece of a team that reached reached the summit of European football. PSG finally captured the Champions League, and Dembele wasn't watching from the sidelines. He was one of the defining figures of the entire campaign. He was named Champions League Player of the Season, and suddenly we have a completely different Ballon d'Or argument. Kane can say, I produce more. Mbappé can say, I dominated the biggest international stage. Messi can say, my legacy and international impact are unmatched. But Dembele can walk into the courtroom and say, I helped lead the best club team in Europe to the biggest trophy in club football. That matters a lot, because one of the easiest mistakes in Ballon d'Or debates is treating individual brilliance and team success like they're enemies. They're not. The perfect candidate combines both, and that is exactly what makes Dembele dangerous. He wasn't simply spectacular, he was spectacular while winning. And that combination is incredibly difficult to defeat. But just when you think we found the challenger, another name appears. And this one is even more uncomfortable, because he isn't a veteran superstar. He's an established Ballon d'Or winner. He's a teenager, Lamine Yamal. And suddenly, the courtroom has gone completely insane, because Yamal's case represents something none of the other candidates can quite replicate. Potential is normally the argument used for young players. He could become the best. He could win it one day. His future is incredible. But Yamal isn't asking us to judge his future. He's asking us to judge what he has already done. And that's a very different conversation. At just 19 years old, Yamal had already produced 16 goals and 11 assists. But again, the numbers are only the beginning, because he wasn't doing this for a mid-table club. He was doing it at Barcelona, and while still carrying expectations that would overwhelm most players twice his age. That's what makes his case so strange. He doesn't have the volume of Kane. He doesn't have Mbappe's World Cup narrative. He doesn't have Messi's historical weight, and he doesn't have Dembele's Champions League dominance. Instead, he offers something different, complete impact. He can create, he can score, he can beat defenders, he can control games, and he helped Barcelona collect major domestic silverware before stepping onto the international stage and competing for the biggest prize of all. This is where the Ballon d'Or debate becomes almost philosophical, because what exactly are we rewarding? The player who produces the most, the player who performs best under pressure, the player with the strongest narrative, the player who leads the best club team, or the player who combines all of those things at an extraordinary level? If it's the first, Kane has the advantage. If it's the second, Mbappé becomes incredibly difficult to ignore. If it's the third, Messi's name will always carry enormous weight. If it's about dominating club football, Dembele suddenly becomes one of the strongest candidates in the entire conversation. And if it's about individual brilliance combined with winning while redefining what a teenage superstar can look like, Yamal has a case of his own. 5 candidates, 5 completely different definitions of greatness. And now we can see why the original 3-man debate was so misleading, because it made the Ballon d'Or look like a simple popularity contest. It isn't. It's a philosophical argument disguised as an individual award. Every candidate forces you to answer a different question. Kane asks, how much should consistency matter? Mbappé asks, how much should the biggest stage matter? Messi asks, how much should legacy and narrative matter? Dembele asks, how much should winning at the highest club level matter? And Yamal asks, how much should complete individual influence matter? Now, here's where things get really uncomfortable, because these arguments don't exist in isolation. They attack each other. If Kane's numbers are the most important thing, then why shouldn't he win? But if the Ballon d'Or is about the most influential player, does raw volume automatically prove that? If Mbappe's international performances are the deciding factor, does a tournament outweigh an entire club campaign? If Messi's story carries the most emotional weight, are we judging the season or his entire career? If Dembele led the best club team to the Champions League, does that automatically make him more deserving than someone with better individual numbers? And if Yamal combined elite individual production with major trophies, does his age make the achievement more impressive, or should age mean absolutely nothing? That's the beauty of this race. There is no candidate without a weakness. Kane has the numbers, but the question is whether his overall team success matches them. Mbappé has the biggest stage argument, but his case becomes vulnerable when the entire season is considered. Messi has the greatest narrative, but narrative can become dangerous when it starts overpowering objective performance. Dembele has the Champions League, but his overall production doesn't reach Kane's level. And Yamal has perhaps the most exciting all-around case, but he's competing against players who have already built enormous careers. Nobody is bulletproof, and that means the final round won't be about finding the candidate with no flaws. That candidate doesn't exist. It will be about deciding which flaws you're willing to forgive, because every Ballon d'Or vote is ultimately a priority list. You are deciding what matters most: consistency, peak performance, legacy, winning, influence. And that's why this race is so much more fascinating than simply asking who scored the most goals. Because if that were the only question, we wouldn't need a Ballon d'Or. We just need a calculator. But football has never been that simple. The award exists because greatness comes in different forms, And this year, those forms have collided. 5 players, 5 arguments, 1 trophy. And now the jury has everything it needs, or at least it thinks it does. Because there's still one final question. After stripping away the reputation, after stripping away the nostalgia, after stripping away the statistics that look impressive on paper, which player actually delivered the strongest combination of individual brilliance, pressure, consistency, and winning? That's where the final verdict begins. And in the last chapter, we're going to put all 5 names on the same scale. No more excuses. No more hiding behind one statistic. No more hiding behind one trophy. No more hiding behind reputation. Just one final question. Who actually deserves the Ballon d'Or? Start with Harry Kane. His case is the easiest to understand. Consistency, production, reliability. For almost an entire football calendar, Kane operated like a machine. He didn't need one magical night to build his case. His case was built through hundreds of small decisions. The movement, the finishing, the positioning, the ability to turn half chances into goals, and the ability to do it again the following week, and then again and again. That matters. Because greatness isn't always spectacular. Sometimes greatness is simply being so good for so long that people stop realizing how difficult it actually is. Kane's biggest strength is also the biggest question surrounding him. Was his season dominant enough outside of the numbers? Because when you strip away the statistics, the Ballon d'Or asks for more than production. It asks for influence, and that's where the other candidates begin closing the gap. Kylian Mbappe doesn't need anyone to explain his relationship with pressure. He's built his entire reputation around it. The biggest stadiums, the biggest matches, the biggest expectations. Mbappe wants the ball when everyone else is afraid to touch it. That's an enormous quality. And when you combine that mentality with his World Cup production, his case becomes almost impossible to ignore. But there is a catch. The Ballon d'Or is not the World Cup Golden Boot. It's an award for an entire year. And that means Mbappe's supporters have to prove that his peak performances outweigh what Kane delivered over the longer marathon. That's the battle. Peak versus consistency. And then there's Messi, the impossible candidate, because with Messi, you can never completely separate the player from the story. His career has accumulated so much history that every new achievement carries extra weight. When he produces on the international stage, the world doesn't simply see another performance. It sees another chapter, and that emotional gravity is real. But here's the uncomfortable question for Messi's case. Are we rewarding the season, or are we rewarding Lionel Messi? Because those two things cannot always be treated as the same. A Ballon d'Or should honor what a player did during the voting period, not everything that player has done across his career. Messi's legacy is enormous, but legacy should not become an automatic advantage. Otherwise, the award stops being about the best player of the year. It becomes a lifetime achievement award, and that's not what the Ballon d'Or is supposed to be. Now look at Ousmane Dembele, and this is where the entire debate becomes uncomfortable, because if the award is about combining individual brilliance with team success, Dembele has an incredibly strong case. He wasn't simply part of PSG's success, he was central to it. The Champions League, the continental dominance, the individual recognition, the goals, the assists, the leadership. He has the exact kind of season that voters traditionally love, a superstar who becomes the face of the best team. And that creates a problem for everyone else, because if you believe the best player should come from the best team, Dembele might be your winner. But then, Lamine Yamal walks into the courtroom, and suddenly we're forced to think about the word we've used throughout this entire video: impact. Yamal's argument isn't simply that he's young. Age should never be the reason someone wins the Ballon d'Or. Being young doesn't make a performance better, but what age does is provide context, because Yamal wasn't being protected from responsibility. He was being given responsibility. He was creating, scoring, taking defenders on, influencing major matches, and doing it while still being younger than many players' professional careers have even properly started. That's extraordinary. But extraordinary doesn't automatically mean deserving, and that's an important distinction, because the Ballon d'Or isn't an award for the player with the most exciting future. It's an award for the player who had the best year, and that's where Yamal's case has to stand on its own. Not because he's 19, but because of what he actually contributed. So, who wins? Let's make the argument as brutally simple as possible. If you value consistency above everything else, you choose Kane. If you value big game and international impact, you choose Mbappe. If you value legacy and international narrative, you choose Messi. If you value club dominance and Champions League success, you choose Dembele. If you value individual influence combined with team success and extraordinary context, you choose Yamal. And that tells us something important. There isn't one objective formula for greatness. There are different ways to define it. But if I had to strip away the emotion, the reputation, and the noise, there is one principle I would use. The Ballon d'Or should reward the player who most completely combined individual excellence with meaningful success during the year. Not simply the most goals, not simply the biggest trophy, not simply the biggest name. The combination. competition. And that's why this race is so difficult, because every candidate owns one part of the equation. Kane owns consistency, Mbappé owns explosiveness, Messi owns narrative gravity, Dembele owns continental success, Yamal owns extraordinary all-around influence. The question is, which combination matters most? And perhaps that's the real reason this year's Ballon d'Or debate has become so chaotic. Football has changed. The modern superstar isn't judged by one thing anymore. Goals matter, assists matter, trophies matter, big games matter, consistency matters, and so does the context surrounding all of them. The Ballon d'Or is trying to compress all of that into one name. That's almost impossible, because imagine being one of these 5 players. You could score more than almost everyone and still be told you didn't win enough. You could dominate the biggest tournament and be told your club season wasn't complete enough. You could win the biggest trophy in club football and be told another player had better individual numbers. You could create one of the greatest teenage seasons we've ever seen and still be told you're too young. There is no perfect candidate, only the candidate whose weaknesses voters are willing to forgive. And that's why, when the envelope is finally opened, the reaction won't just tell us who won. It will tell us what football values right now. Does football value the marathon? Does it value the biggest stage? Does it value history? Does it value winning? Or does it value the emergence of something completely new? Because this isn't just a Ballon d'Or vote. It's a vote on what greatness means. And after everything we've seen, I want to know what you think. Harry Kane, the machine, the marathon runner, the statistical monster, Kylian Mbappe, the big game predator, the player built for pressure, Lionel Messi, the eternal superstar, the international icon, Ousmane Dembele, the Champions League king, the leader of Europe's dominant club side, or Lamine Yamal, the teenager who's already forcing the football world to rethink what is possible. So he deserves the Ballon d'Or. Don't just give me a name, tell me why. Because after everything we've seen, there is no easy answer. And that's exactly what makes this Ballon d'Or race so special. The old kings, the established superstars, the new generation. 5 different definitions of greatness fighting for one crown. So tell me, who are you giving the Ballon d'Or to? And if you love football stories like this, subscribe, because the biggest debates in football are only getting started.